May 15, 1943, Carlsbad Army Airfield, New Mexico. If you were standing on the hot tarmac of the Carlsbad Airfield on that Saturday morning, the first thing you would have noticed was the silence. It was a brand new facility, built in the middle of the desert to train American pilots for the war in the Pacific. It was pristine. The hangars were made of fresh, expensive pine wood that smelled of varnish. The control tower gleamed with glass and steel. The barracks were painted a crisp military white. Parked in front of the main operations building was a sleek, polished staff car belonging to a high-ranking general from Washington, D.C. The chrome bumpers reflected the brutal New Mexico sun like a mirror. A group of VIPs, generals, colonels, and top scientists were gathered in the shade of a hangar wing, wiping sweat from their foreheads. They were waiting for a demonstration. They had been told they were about to see a weapon that would end the war. They expected a new fighter plane or perhaps a new type of heavy bomb. Instead, they were watching a 60-year-old dentist named Dr. Lytle S. Adams fiddle with the latch of a refrigerated delivery truck. Adams looked nervous. He wasn't a soldier, he was a civilian, wearing a suit that was too warm for the weather. He signaled to the handlers. "Open it up," he said, "but be careful, they are sleeping." The handlers cracked the seal on the truck. Inside were hundreds of cardboard crates, and inside those crates were the soldiers of this new army. They weren't men. They were Mexican free-tailed bats. But these weren't normal bats. Strapped to the chest of every single sleeping bat was a device no larger than a thumb drive. It was a canister of jellied gasoline, a brand-new classified substance called napalm attached to a mechanical time delay fuse. The plan was simple, controlled, scientific. Take the sleeping bats out of the truck, load them into a B-25 bomber, fly them to a test range 20 miles away, drop them, watch them burn down a few dummy targets. But at approximately 10 a.m., the laws of thermodynamics intervened. As the handlers opened the doors, the blistering 100-degree heat of the desert slammed into the interior of the truck. The delicate thermal equilibrium inside the crates collapsed instantly. The bats were supposed to be in a state of artificial hibernation induced by the cold, but the heat hit them like a physical blow. They woke up, and they didn't wake up groggy. They woke up in a panic. Before the handlers could reseal the doors, a high-pitched screeching sound erupted from the truck. It sounded like grinding metal. Then a chaotic vortex of black wings exploded into the air. Hundreds of bats, armed with live incendiary weapons, surged into the sky. The generals watched in stunned silence. They couldn't shoot them. They were too small and too fast. They couldn't catch them. They could only watch as the bats did exactly what millions of years of evolution had taught them to do. They were nocturnal creatures, suddenly exposed to blinding daylight. They were terrified. They needed darkness. They needed shade. They needed a roost. And the only roosts for miles were the pristine wooden buildings of the Carlsbad Army Airfield. One by one, the bats dove. A squadron of them flew under the wooden eaves of the operations building. Another group squeezed into the dark, dry rafters of the main hangar. A third group found the officers' barracks, crawling deep into the crawl spaces and attics. And then there was the single most unlucky bat in military history. This lone soldier found the perfect shady spot to roost, the undercarriage of the general's personal staff car, directly beneath the fuel tank. The base went silent. The bats were hidden now. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. The soldiers stood on the tarmac, looking at each other. Dr. Adams stood by the empty truck, his face pale. He knew what was happening inside the walls. The mechanical fuses on the bats' chests were ticking. A tiny acid vial had broken. It was slowly eating through a steel retaining wire. Tick, 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 snap. From the roof of the operations building, a small pop was heard. It sounded like a pistol shot.
A moment later, a distinct violent whoosh echoed across the tarmac. A 10-inch tongue of blue-white fire shot out from under the eaves. The napalm ignited. And because it was napalm, it didn't just flash and die. It stuck. It clung to the dry wooden beams of the roof. It burned at 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Fire alarms began to wail. Fire! Fire and ops! But before the fire trucks could even start their engines, a second pop was heard from the hangar, then a third from the barracks. The base was igniting simultaneously from multiple points. This wasn't a fire that started on the outside where it could be sprayed with water. This was a fire that started deep in the bones of the buildings, in the darkest, driest recesses of the attics where the bats had crawled. The wooden structures, seasoned by the dry desert air, went up like matchsticks. The flames roared through the roofs. Windows blew out from the heat. The control tower, a skeleton of timber and glass, turned into a torch. And then, the car. The bat roosting under the general's personal staff car exploded. The fuel line melted. The gasoline in the tank ignited. The car vanished in a fireball of black smoke and burning rubber. It was absolute chaos. Men ran with buckets. Trucks sprayed foam. But the fire was out of control. The baby incendiary was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was creating an unquenchable, spreading firestorm. In less than an hour, the Carlsbad Army airfield was gone. It was a pile of smoldering ash, twisted steel, and humiliation. The United States Air Force had just successfully firebombed itself. As the general watched his car melt into the tarmac, he slowly turned to the terrified dentist standing next to him. He didn't scream. He didn't order an arrest. He simply stared at the destruction with a look of terrifying realization and said, "It works." This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not internet folklore. This is the true declassified story of Project X-Ray. It is the story of how the U.S. government, in a time of desperate rage, spent the equivalent of $35 million to kidnap millions of bats, turn them into arsonists, and attempt to burn the city of Tokyo to the ground.
To understand why the most powerful military in the world would listen to a crazy idea from a dentist, you have to understand the psychology of America in December 1941. The date was December 7th, a Sunday. Across the United States, families were sitting down to lunch. Then the radios interrupted the music. In Hawaii, the world was ending. The Japanese Imperial Navy had launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The sky was filled with zeros. The water of the harbor was burning with oil and blood. 2,400 Americans were dead. The national mood changed instantly. It wasn't just fear, it was a blinding, white-hot rage. Americans didn't just want to win the war, they wanted revenge. They wanted to strike back at the heart of the Japanese Empire. They wanted to see Tokyo burn. But there was a problem, a massive geographical problem. Japan was thousands of miles away. The Pacific Ocean was now controlled by the enemy. The U.S. had no forward bases, no way to launch a bomber fleet. The military planners in Washington were desperate. They were open to anything, and I mean anything. Enter Dr. Lytle S. Adams. Lytle Adams was driving his car through the American Southwest on that Sunday afternoon when he heard the news of Pearl Harbor. Adams was 60 years old. He lived in Irwin, Pennsylvania. By trade, he was a dental surgeon. He spent his days staring into mouths, drilling cavities, and fitting dentures. But Adams wasn't your average small-town dentist. He was an inventor, a tinkerer, a man who refused to accept the world as it was. Years earlier, he had invented a system for the U.S. Postal Service called the airmail pickup, where a plane could snatch a bag of mail off the ground without landing. Because of this invention, Adams had connections. Specifically, he was a close personal friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. On that drive in December 1941, Adams was seething with the same rage as every other American. He pulled his car to the side of the road. He wanted to help. He wanted to destroy the enemy.
But what could a dentist do? He continued his vacation. A few days later, fate intervened. He arrived at Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Carlsbad is a geological wonder. It is a massive hole in the earth. But Adams wasn't there for the rocks. He was there at twilight. Every evening, millions of Mexican free-tailed bats pour out of the cave mouth to hunt insects. It looks like a plume of black smoke rising from the ground. The sound of their wings is a low, thrumming roar. Adams stood on the ridge, watching this river of life explode into the sky. He watched how they moved. They were agile, they were fast, they were unrelenting. And then he had an epiphany. He looked at the bats, and then he thought about the cities of Japan. Adams knew that Japanese architecture was fundamentally different from American architecture. Western cities were built of stone, brick, concrete, and steel. They were hard to burn. But Tokyo? In 1941, Tokyo was built of wood, bamboo, and paper. The walls were shoji screens made of rice paper. The floors were tatami mats made of dried straw. The houses were packed together in dense neighborhoods. Tokyo wasn't a fortress. It was a campfire waiting for a spark. Adams did the math in his head. A bat can carry its young in flight. A baby bat weighs nearly as much as the mother. Therefore, a bat can carry a payload. Bats are nocturnal. They hate the light. If you dropped them over a city at dawn, they wouldn't fly around aimlessly. They would instinctively seek darkness. Where is the darkness in a Japanese city? Under the eaves of the roof, in the attic, in the bamboo walls. The idea formed fully in his mind. If you strapped a small, time-delayed firebomb to a bat and dropped 1 million of them over Tokyo, they would disperse. They would dive into the city. They would crawl into the most flammable parts of the houses, the attics, and go to sleep. And then 1 million timers would go off at once. The city wouldn't just burn, it would be consumed. The fire department would be overwhelmed instantly. It would be a weapon of mass destruction made of biology and gasoline. Adams went back to his hotel room and wrote a letter. He didn't send it to the War Department, he sent it to the White House. The letter read, "This man-made creation of yours and mine is designed to frighten, demoralize, and excite the prejudices of the Japanese Empire." Eleanor Roosevelt put the letter on the president's desk. Franklin D. Roosevelt read it, and in one of the most surprising memos in presidential history, he wrote to his spy chief, Colonel William Donovan, "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into." The green light was given. Project X-ray was born.
Adams was now a government contractor. He had a budget, a team of scientists, and a mission: find the perfect bat. This led to one of the strangest road trips in history. Adams and his team loaded up a government van and spent months touring the caves of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. They were auditioning species. They looked at the mastiff bat, too rare. They looked at the pallid bat, too fragile. They kept coming back to the Mexican free-tailed bat. It weighed only about 14 grams, half an ounce. It was tiny, but it was strong. Adams discovered that the free-tail could take off carrying nearly 3 times its own body weight. It was the B-29 bomber of the animal kingdom. And the supply was inexhaustible. In just 4 caves in Texas, Adams estimated there were 20 million bats. They didn't need to build the planes, they just had to catch them. The team developed a collection method. They strung massive nets across the mouths of the caves. When the bats swarmed out at dusk, they flew right into the nets. The scientists could harvest thousands of recruits in a single hour. But now they had a physics problem. How do you strap a bomb to a bat? Adams tried gluing dummy bombs to their chests. The bats chewed them off. He tried tying them to their legs. The bats couldn't fly. They tumbled out of the air. Eventually, they designed a surgical clip. It pierced the loose skin on the bat's chest. With the clip, the bomb hung directly under the bat's center of gravity. Adams ran flight tests in gymnasiums and warehouses. They flew perfectly. The delivery system was set. Now they needed the fire.
While Adams was chasing bats in Texas, the War Department turned to the chemists. They needed a bomb that was small, lighter than an ounce, but burned hot enough to ignite solid wood. Standard explosives like TNT were useless. They exploded. They didn't burn. They turned to a man named Louis Fieser. Fieser was a chemist at Harvard University. He was working on a secret project to thicken gasoline. He mixed gasoline with aluminum naphthenate and aluminum palmitate. He called the resulting substance napalm. When the Army approached Fieser and told him they needed a bomb for a bat, he didn't blink. He saw it as the perfect test for his new gel. Fieser went into his lab at Harvard and designed the baby incendiary. It was a masterpiece of miniaturization. The casing was made of cellulose nitrate, the same plastic used to make ping pong balls. It was lightweight and flammable. But the real genius was the fuse. How do you trigger a bomb strapped to an animal? You can't use a clockwork timer because the ticking noise might scare the bat, and the metal gears were too heavy. Fieser used chemistry. The fuse was a spring-loaded firing pin held back by a thin steel wire. Next to the wire was a tiny glass ampule filled with copper chloride, a corrosive acid. The mechanism worked like this. The bats are loaded into the plane. As they are dropped, a mechanical arm crushes the glass ampule. The acid spills onto the steel wire. The acid slowly eats through the metal. It takes exactly 30 minutes for the wire to snap. When it snaps, the firing pin strikes the primer. The napalm ignites. 30 minutes. That was the magic window. It gave the bat enough time to fall from the plane, wake up, fly down to the city, find a house, crawl inside the attic, and settle down to sleep. So by early 1943, the team had all the pieces. They had the bat, they had the bomb, they had the fuse. Now they just had to figure out how to put it all together without killing themselves. This led to the ice cube problem. Bats are frantic creatures. If you put 1,000 of them in a box, they will panic, overheat, and die. Adams realized he had to put the Army to sleep. Bats are mammals that hibernate. Adams designed a transport system that was essentially a freezer. He cooled the bats down to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the bats stopped moving. Their heart rates dropped. They became stiff little fuzzy blocks. They could be stacked in trays like eggs. The plan was for the bomber to drop the canister, a parachute would deploy. At 1,000 feet, the sides of the canister would fall away. The trays would be exposed to the warm air, the bats would tumble out, wake up, and disperse. It was a beautiful theory, but as the disaster at Carlsbad proved, reality is messy.
After the airbase burned down, the Army was embarrassed, but they were also intrigued. The bats had burned down the base with terrifying efficiency. The project wasn't canceled, it was promoted. But they moved it to a place where they couldn't accidentally burn down any more American infrastructure. They moved to the Dugway Proving Ground in the Utah desert, and they decided to build a city just to kill it. The Army needed scientific data. They couldn't just guess how well the bats would burn a Japanese city. They needed to see it. So, in the middle of the desolate Utah salt flats, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began one of the most surreal construction projects of the war. They built Japanese Village. This wasn't a Hollywood set made of plywood facades. This was a forensic reconstruction of a Tokyo neighborhood. The Army hired architects who had lived in Japan. They imported authentic materials. They wove authentic tatami floor mats from dried straw. They installed shoji screens made of rice paper. They even recreated the specific air gaps found in Japanese attics. They built 12 fully furnished buildings. They laid them out in a grid that mimicked the density of an industrial district in Tokyo. They put furniture inside. They put clothes in the closets. They created a ghost town, perfect in every detail, waiting to die. In December 1943, the Dugway Village test began. A B-29 bomber flew high over the Utah desert. In its bomb bay was the newly refined bat bomb canister. The bay doors opened. The canister dropped. At 1,000 feet, the sides fell away.
The trays were exposed to the air. Observers on the ground watched through high-powered binoculars. They saw a dark cloud spill out of the bomb. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the bats fell like stones. Then the warm air hit them. Thousands of leathery wings snapped open. The bats circled once, orienting themselves. Then, guided by their sonar and their instinct, they dove for the village. They swarmed the fake houses. They crawled under the eaves. They vanished into the attics. Within minutes, the sky was clear. The village looked peaceful. Then the timers ran out. Smoke began to curl from the roof of the first house, then the second, then the third. The fires didn't start on the surface, they started deep inside the structures. The napalm ignited the tatami mats, the rice paper walls flash burned, the bamboo frames caught fire. Because the bats had crawled into the most inaccessible parts of the buildings, the fires were impossible to fight. The roofs collapsed inward. The heat was so intense it melted the sand around the foundations. In a matter of hours, the Japanese village was nothing but a grid of glowing embers. The chief chemist of the project wrote a report that made its way to the highest levels of the Pentagon. The numbers were undeniable. The regular bomb would give probably 167 to 400 fires per bomb load, where the bat bomb would give 3,625 to 4,748 fires. One plane load of bats could start nearly 5,000 fires. No fire department in the world could handle 500,000 fires. The city wouldn't just be damaged, it would be vaporized. It would be a firestorm of biblical proportions. Dr. Adams was vindicated. His crazy idea was no longer a joke. It was the deadliest weapon in the American arsenal.
By 1944, the Army Air Force handed the project over to the Marine Corps. The Marines loved it. They planned to use it as a tactical weapon for the island hopping campaign. They stockpiled 300,000 bats. They ordered the production of 1 million bombs. They were ready for a combat deployment in mid-1945. But Dr. Adams had a rival he didn't even know existed. While Adams was playing with bats in the Utah desert, another group of scientists was working in the New Mexico desert. But they weren't working with biology, they were working with physics. The Manhattan Project. Robert Oppenheimer and his team were racing toward the same finish line. The War Department had a choice between two superweapons. Weapon A, the bat bomb, cheap, biological, messy. Weapon B, the atomic bomb, expensive, clean, godlike power. The generals loved machines. They loved steel. They did not like biology. Biology was unpredictable. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, looked at the final reports. The bat bomb project was asking for more time. They said they would be ready by August 1945. He looked at the Manhattan Project updates. The Trinity test, the first detonation of a nuclear weapon, was scheduled for July 1945. The bat bomb was redundant. In a cold, bureaucratic memo, Admiral King canceled Project X-ray. The reason given was simple. The project is moving too slowly. Dr. Adams was heartbroken. He had spent years of his life, risked his reputation, burned down an airbase, and proved the concept beyond a shadow of a doubt. And he had lost. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. Adams spent the rest of his life arguing that his weapon would have been the humane choice. The bats would have started fires in the attics, he said. People would have smelled smoke. They would have run out of the houses. The atomic bomb gave no warning. It vaporized them. Project X-ray officially cost the U.S. taxpayer $2 million. For that money, the military got a lot of dead bats and a burned-down airbase. But Lytle Adams was a visionary. He was trying to build the world's first swarm drone weapon. He just used bats instead of computers. Today, the files are declassified, and if you go to Carlsbad Caverns at twilight, you can still see the descendants of those bats flying out of the cave.
You are looking at the veterans of a war that never happened. And somewhere, in the ghost of a burned-down hangar in New Mexico, the spirit of a general is still looking at his melted car, saying, "It works."
But the story doesn't end in the desert. The legacy of Project X-Ray is stranger and more persistent than a simple cancellation order. While the atomic bomb became the defining image of the 20th century, a symbol of cold, industrial, godlike power, the bat bomb became a kind of underground legend. It became a symbol of something else entirely, American ingenuity gone off the rails. It's easy to laugh at Dr. Adams. It's easy to picture the slapstick comedy of a general chasing a bat around a burning hangar. But if we peel back the layers of ridicule, we find a terrifying brilliance. Consider the baby incendiary itself. This wasn't just a bomb, it was a masterpiece of chemistry. Louis Pfizer, the man who invented it, didn't stop with bats. The gel he created, napalm, went on to become the most controversial and devastating conventional weapon of the Vietnam War. The very same sticky fire that was meant to be carried by a 14-gram mammal ended up being dropped by the ton from F-4 Phantoms. The bat bomb was the innocent ancestor of a horrific lineage. And what about the bats themselves? The Mexican free-tailed bat is a creature of habit. Scientists today study them for their swarm intelligence. They move in groups of millions without colliding. They communicate target locations. They are, in every sense, a biological algorithm. When Lytle Adams looked at that cave in 1941, he wasn't just seeing animals. He was seeing a distributed network. He was seeing the future of warfare. In the 21st century, the Pentagon is obsessed with micro-drones. They want to release thousands of tiny insect-sized robots that can enter a building, identify a target, and detonate. They call it the Perdix drone system. But look at the specs of a Perdix drone. It is small. It flies in a swarm. It is autonomous. It carries a small payload. Dr. Adams built this in 1942. He just didn't have the silicon chips to build the body, so he borrowed one from nature. He hacked the biological software of a mammal to do the job of a robot. The failure of Project X-Ray wasn't that the idea was bad. The failure was that biology is harder to control than physics. An atom doesn't get scared. An atom doesn't get hungry. An atom doesn't decide to roost under a general's car because it's too hot outside. Dr. Adams died in 1970. He never saw the rise of the drone age, but he went to his grave believing that he had been cheated. He believed that if the Army had just given him 6 more months, he could have saved the world from the nuclear nightmare. He imagined a world where wars were fought not by vaporizing cities, but by burning them down with surgical precision, house by house, bat by bat. It is a strange moral calculus, arguing that a firestorm is more humane than radiation, but war forces us into strange logic. So the next time you are in the American Southwest, stop by Carlsbad Caverns. Stand at the mouth of the cave as the sun goes down. Wait for the sound, the low, thrumming roar of millions of wings. Watch them rise into the twilight like smoke. And as you watch them, remember the burning of the Carlsbad airfield. Remember the panic. Remember the smell of gasoline and sawdust. And remember that for a brief, insane moment in history, the most dangerous weapon on Earth wasn't a missile or a bomber. It was a tiny, furry creature with a heartbeat, a hunger, and a time bomb ticking on its chest. This has been the story of Project X-Ray, the weapon that worked too well.